Get your tickets in. Eric, you have a switch? I don't even have to do my job. Eric Gerbrandt is going to speak again about selections from the BC breeding program for blueberry and strawberry.
They give us this on-screen pointer. It's because of an incident last year. They trusted me with the pointy one, and I got a little crazy with it, so they made it on the screen now. Yeah. Again, so if you weren't in the Caneberry meeting just prior, I'm filling in for Michael Dossett today. He's away at another meeting and sends his regrets, and he sent his unworthy understudy to present for him. So he's the breeder, and I do other work in support of what he does. So looking at his the BC berry breeding program, we've got some priorities that we call primary priorities to look at developing machine harvestable varieties that have an improved growth habit so that we can develop varieties with firmer fruit that can be marketed in the fresh market after having been machine harvested. Having earlier and later cultivars is also a priority, and having concentrated ripening for each particular cultivar. Some secondary characteristics that are being pursued are resistance to shock and scorch virus, which are a very difficult target to hit, as Chad alluded to, as well as bringing in some tolerance to root rot. And in that regard, Michael's done some traveling around in the marshlands in New Jersey and other places to get wild germplasm that might have those sorts of traits that can be introgressed into the germplasm. And then with the plethora of bacterial and fungal diseases that we deal with, breeding for improvements in those regard are also key targets. So just an overview of the process. It's a long breeding process to go from making crosses between cultivars and parent material until final release. In the first year, varieties are crossed, and then the seedlings that are generated from those crosses are evaluated in the third and fourth year. And made as selections, and then those selections are put out into a range of different types of trials to figure out whether or not they've got potential. The typical process is to put them into a replicated yield trial, typically on a research station, an evaluation for a couple of years before then taking it out to grower trials. And we're actually trying to speed things up here a little bit, short circuit the system, and jump over a couple of years by taking 3 to 5 selections each year out of his program and getting them out to growers ASAP so that we can figure out sooner than later whether or not they're going to end up as cultivars. And so that means sending out a lot more duds than than we normally would, but it also means trying to cut out a couple of years and more quickly identifying those that are going to end up having cultivar quality. Some of the phenotyping work that Michael's program does, and phenotyping is looking at what we see in terms of the actual fruit itself. Fruit quality is a major concern, and so one thing that has been added to the program recently is bruising tendency. So this is somewhat different than firmness, and it's different than splitting in that it is a measure of the degree of damage that a berry will sustain in a simulated machine harvesting situation. So what they've done is developed a protocol where they take a berry and drop it from 1 meter of height, and then they go and store it for 48 hours, cut it open, and then visually score it for the degree of bruising. And so the reason why this is important is because this is not the exact same thing as firmness. You can take it, use one of those little firm tech machines it's kind of like Guantanamo Bay for blueberries, I guess, but it's a kind of a torture device for blueberries. You can get a measurement of firmness from that, but bruising is a slightly different trait, and so that's why this has been included in the breeding program. Another aspect of fruit quality is splitting tendency. And just to highlight some of the findings over the last couple of years, the program has done something called heritability analysis, where you look at the degree to which a trait is likely to have to be carried forward from one generation to the next. And the degree of splitting has been found to have a considerable amount of heritability, moderate heritability estimate, which means that the program should have success in making progress in decreasing tendency for splitting in the future. Some data that Michael and I worked on last year. Says I coordinated a system of grower trials to take his material and the material from breeding programs like Fall Creek that we'll hear about next, and other programs around the world. When we take that out to grower fields, we try to do some general evaluation of quality. And so one thing that Michael and I worked on last year was to look at fruit firmness using that firm tech machine I mentioned to compare some of his selections against material coming from other regions, and then also some industry standards. And so the different colors here are different harvest dates, and these are across different sites. So we had we were just doing our best to be able to make apples to apples comparisons. The different colors are different dates, and then you can see firmness being pretty high for some of these prospective varieties coming out of our program. In comparison to, say, Duke, which is way down there at the far end of firmness. And then in the mix there, if you look across the red bars particularly, you can see some comparison of genotypes like Top Shelf and Blue Ribbon against Calypso and Huron. Going forward, any cultivar that is released, it's basically going to have fruit quality that is as good or better than anything that is out there. And then hopefully with added adaptation to our region, better disease tolerance, maybe greater ease of management, or greater yields in general. Some first round of selections that Michael made and that we're now trying to get out to grower trials are these listed numbers, which won't provide too much context to you. So I'll just try and give you a couple of highlights about these varieties, or these selections rather. Sorry, working up, not my notes, but Michael's here. These are three selections that are kind of the second round that have come out even more recently than those first set of four. And these ones we're getting out to grower trials also as quickly as possible in order to get as wide a range of observations across soil types and microclimates, and more importantly, to get growers' opinions as soon as possible so that we can make informed decisions as to what is going to make it in the industry. One of particular interest, the selected in 2012, as you can tell by the first number there in that string, is 12635. I'm not going to detail all of the traits here, but what's really interesting is that it is likely one of the firmest things I've ever seen. This is data we generated in 2014, so very recently after this was selected. You can see blue crop there on the bottom. This is firmness after 5 weeks of storage. So we looked at firmness at every 7-day interval after harvest. You can see the blue crop is lower, of course. Duke is that next one up. Draper is even higher, and then this BC 12635 kind of blew it out of the water. So this is was some very early evidence to show that we're making good genetic progress in regard to an extremely important trait for developing a fresh market processed industry for shipping across the world. Another selection, you can see by the poor quality of the photos here. These are photos I took and added in here. I'm a terrible photographer in comparison to Michael. This selection, and you can see the size there in relation to the loonie. That's our dollar in Canada. This one is similar to Draper in firmness, but not quite as high as 12635. But if you look at that previous chart we saw there, it doesn't necessarily have to be as firm as 12635 to be a cultivar, as long as it's beating whatever else is out there. Seasonality is going to be key. If we can find replacement for mid-season varieties, that's going to be a strategic move for us. Another couple of selections I'm going to breeze through here are 1440-158 and 1442-1. Both of them set a lot of flower buds, which is likely going to be important for us because as we're a very high latitude region, one of our challenges is having genetics for material that tend to shut down at an appropriate time in the summer and start converting their vegetative buds over to floral buds. And so having selections in the process that have got a high degree of bud set is important. This data that generated this year, unreplicated comparisons of firmness, and just a plug for our BC short course presentations at the end of January. I'm going to be presenting some data that was part of a larger project, that this is just a little side shoot off of, looking at firmness and fruit quality in mostly Fall Creek varieties, the top shelf, Cargo, Last Call, Blue Ribbon, and Clockwork, in comparison to some standards, as well as Calypso and a couple other genotypes. So I'm going to be giving a presentation in a couple of months on that if you were coming to our event in BC. But one little bit of data that came out of that to compare some of our BC selections. This is firmness at 1, 3, and 5 weeks in cooler storage. And if we look, I can use the magical red dot here. There's blue crop at the bottom there. That's the only standard that I included in this particular set of genotypes. And then we've got these this broad range and quite high firmness, exceedingly high firmness, I would say, even though this is unreplicated. So there's not a whole bunch of data to back this up, but we are making progress in firmness. Going on to strawberries, it's a relatively small program in comparison to raspberries and blueberries, and that's related to our not so large industry in strawberries. The primary objective is to maintain selection pressure on day neutrals, and that it requires crossing with June-bearing varieties because there's not enough genetic variability within day neutral germplasm to permit just breeding with day neutrals. So Michael makes about 3,000 seedlings of strawberries each year, and has to include a day neutral in each of those crosses, and then day neutrality or remontancy segregates in populations. Those can be selected in the spring in order to determine whether they've got potential as a June bearer or a day neutral. And then they're monitored throughout the rest of the season to differentiate between the day neutrals and the June-bearing types. The problem there is that propagation is a bit of an issue in that, as Chad was mentioning, some day neutrals are exceedingly difficult to get to runner, and that's the way that we get new plants to evaluate. Further issue, if you've seen any of Michael's talks over the last 3 years, we've been talking about BC 10.2.1 for quite some time now. It's been hanging around in virus cleanup for I think 2.5, almost 3 years now. And so we're hoping that will be released from that process very soon so that we can get a good look at it here in BC. It had good feedback in Quebec, where it was about 10% higher yielding than Albion, but not quite as good as Seascape. So we're excited to see whether or not that's going to have potential as the day neutral in the Pacific Northwest. Some brief pictures of a few of the wonderful fruit coming out of the seedling plots. And I walked through the plots a couple of years ago with Michael. We tasted strawberries until we could taste no more. And my comment was to him, wow, there's some stuff here that really rivals Albion. It's a question of whether or not we're going to get the type of productivity that Albion gets. So fruit quality, size, flavor, firmness, those are all key criteria that are being used for selection and evaluation of advanced selections. And with that, Michael thanks all the funding, especially the BC Blueberry Council and BC Strawberry Growers Association, as well as all the other people that support the work that he does. And he always says, I'm sorry if I missed anybody inadvertently, so I will repeat that for him and put up his contact information if you would like to get in contact with him. And otherwise, I can answer any questions to the best of my ability.
Any questions for Eric?